The first-class cabin buzzed with quiet luxury. Passengers sipped champagne, scrolled through their phones, or flipped through newspapers as flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle. The hum of conversation blended with the soft clinking of glasses, a world of privilege and routine. Everything seemed perfectly normal until it wasn't. Just as the cabin crew prepared for takeoff, a hushed conversation near the entrance caught JD Vance's attention. The flight attendant whispered something to the captain, her face tightening with concern. Then the unexpected happened. The cabin door swung open again, and in stepped Clint Eastwood. Even at 93, he carried an undeniable presence, a living legend, the man who had shaped generations with his steely grit and quiet strength. But something was off. His expression, usually calm and composed, flickered with frustration. His gaze swept the cabin, searching, then hardening. A murmur rippled through the passengers. What was happening? JD Vance sat back in his seat watching as Clint exchanged a few sharp words with the flight attendant. Then it hit him. Clint's seat, his first-class seat, was broken. For a moment, silence gripped the cabin. People stole glances at one another, waiting for someone to do something, but no one moved. This was first class, after all. Here, problems were handled with quiet efficiency, with compensation and apologies, not sacrifices. JD Vance's heart pounded. He had grown up watching The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, repeating Clint's legendary lines under his breath as a kid. And now here he was, sitting comfortably while Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, stood stranded. Then, before he even realized what he was doing, JD stood up. The sound of his seatbelt unbuckling was louder than it should have been. Heads turned. A hush spread through the cabin. JD cleared his throat, his voice steady but firm. "Mr. Eastwood, take my seat." The words cut through the air like a lightning bolt. Passengers froze. Some gasped. A businessman 2 rows over muttered, "The vice president is giving up his seat?" Clint Eastwood lifted his gaze, his weathered face lined with surprise. "Son, JD raised a hand, stopping him. "Please, I insist." And just like that, the entire plane held its breath. For a long moment, Clint Eastwood just sat there, his weathered hands resting on the armrests of the first-class seat that wasn't supposed to be his. His jaw clenched, his eyes locked onto JD Vance, searching, as if trying to understand why. Why the Vice President of the United States would willingly give up his seat for him. The first-class cabin, once filled with quiet luxury and idle conversation, was now utterly silent. Passengers who had been sipping champagne, flipping through newspapers, or mindlessly scrolling through their phones had all stopped. The hum of the engines was the only sound left in the air. Everyone was waiting, watching, sensing that something profound had just happened. Clint finally exhaled, shaking his head slightly, his voice rough with something unspoken. "Son, JD Vance, still standing beside him, raised a hand, stopping him. "Please, I insist." Clint's fingers curled around the armrests. Even at 93, he was still the same strong, steady man America had known for decades, but there was something different in his eyes now. Something unguarded. "I don't know what to say," Clint murmured. JD smiled, shaking his head. "Then don't say anything, just take the seat." For the first time, Clint Eastwood hesitated. He wasn't a man accustomed to accepting help. He had built a legacy on standing strong, on being the man who handled things on his own. But now, he was silent, as if fighting some internal battle that no one else could see. Then, just as JD was about to turn away, Clint spoke again. His voice was lower this time, more fragile than anyone in the cabin had ever heard it. "You just reminded me of someone, kid. Someone I lost." A ripple of stillness swept through the passengers. Even the flight attendants, usually trained to move seamlessly through any situation, stopped in their tracks. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken. JD frowned slightly, his heart beginning to pound. "Who?" Clint swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His hands, rough with age and experience, tightened into fists. "My son." The words landed like a shockwave. JD's breath caught in his throat. He had heard stories about Clint Eastwood's children, but this was something different. This wasn't just the mention of family. This was loss. Clint's voice, usually as firm as the characters he played, wavered. He was like you, selfless, strong-willed, always thinking of others first. His breath hitched slightly. I lost him, and I never got to tell him how proud I was. The weight of those words settled over the cabin like a blanket. The passengers, who had moments ago been enjoying their luxuries, now found themselves gripping the edges of their armrests, blinking back unexpected tears. A woman across the aisle reached for a tissue. A businessman who had been casually observing now swallowed hard, shifting in his seat. JD could feel it too, the lump forming in his throat, the tightness in his chest. He wanted to say something, anything, but what could you say to a man who had carried grief for years? Then Clint did something no one expected. He reached up and took JD's hand in his own. His grip was strong, not just physically but emotionally. It wasn't just a handshake, it was something more, something deeper. The kind of grip that told you everything a man couldn't say out loud. Thank you, son. The words were simple, but they shattered the cabin. Men who had spent their lives hiding their emotions found themselves rubbing their eyes. Women sniffled, dabbing at their cheeks. Even the flight attendants, trained to keep their composure, looked away, overwhelmed by the moment. JD felt his throat tighten. He had grown up watching Clint Eastwood on the big screen, watching him play cowboys, outlaws, and heroes. But right now, in this moment, Clint wasn't any of those things. He wasn't the Hollywood legend. He was just a father, mourning a son he had lost long ago. The moment stretched, raw and unfiltered. Finally, JD found his voice. He stopped, shaking his head. I'm sorry. Clint nodded slowly, his fingers still gripping JD's hand. People always tell me that, but no one's ever given me a moment like this. The cabin remained quiet. JD could feel the weight in the air, the unspoken emotions passing between every single person on that plane. Then Clint's fingers trembled slightly as he let go. He blinked rapidly, exhaling shakily, and for the first time in years in front of strangers in a place where no one expected vulnerability, Clint Eastwood wept, and the world would never forget what happened next. The plane hummed steadily as it cut through the sky, but inside the first-class cabin the world had gone still. Clint Eastwood sat in JD Vance's former seat, staring ahead, but his eyes weren't focused on the cab, the passengers, or the luxury around him. They were somewhere else, somewhere far away. JD, now seated in the economy section, found himself glancing back, watching the legendary actors sit in silent contemplation. A man like Clint Eastwood wasn't supposed to look lost. He was the man who had stared down outlaws, faced impossible odds, and walked away without flinching. And yet here he was, his jaw tight, his hands resting motionless on the armrests, his mind clearly caught in memories too painful to speak. Then, out of nowhere, a flight attendant hesitated near Clint's seat. She held something in her hands, something small, old, and carefully folded. "Mr. Eastwood?" she said softly. Clint turned to her, his expression unreadable. The attendant looked down at the paper, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it out to him. "Sir, I think this belongs to you." Clint hesitated, his brows knitting together. Slowly he reached out and took it. The moment his fingers brushed the paper, something shifted in his face. JD noticed it immediately, the recognition, the disbelief, the way Clint held the note as if it were a ghost from his past come to life. "What is it?" JD asked before he could stop himself. Clint didn't answer at first. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper with the careful precision of a man who already knew, deep down, what he was holding. Then he read the first words aloud. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means fate brought this letter to you when you needed it the most." The air in the cabin tightened. Passengers who had been pretending not to eavesdrop suddenly leaned in, holding their breath. JD felt his pulse quicken. "Dad?" Clint swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. His son's handwriting, his son's words, frozen in time. JD could see the raw emotion in Clint's face, the way his lips pressed together like he was fighting against something bigger than himself. Clint cleared his throat and continued. "You always taught me to do what's right, to stand up for others. If you're reading this, Dad, promise me one thing. Keep doing the same. The world still needs you." His voice cracked on the last word. JD clenched his jaw, his throat burning. Around them, people wiped at their eyes. A businessman near the aisle turned away, pretending to look at the window, but his shoulders were stiff, affected like everyone else. Clint exhaled shakily and kept reading. "And Dad, if you ever meet someone like me, someone who reminds you of me, tell them I said thank you." The words hit JD like a freight train. Clint's breath hitched. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the letter. His weathered face, the face the world had always known to be unshakable, was etched with something raw and breaking. Then, slowly, he lifted his gaze and looked at JD. JD's stomach twisted. No one moved. No one spoke. The plane's engines roared in the background, but inside the cabin all that existed was the weight of that letter. The weight of a son's final words carried through time, delivered by fate. JD swallowed, his throat dry. "Sir, Clint reached forward and took JD's hand in his own. His grip was firm, but not just in the way a handshake should be. It was something deeper, something final. "Kid," Clint whispered, his voice barely more than a breath, "you don't know what you've done for me today." JD felt the lump in his throat grow. He wanted to say something, but nothing felt big enough for this moment. Then Clint did something no one in the cabin would ever forget. He pressed the letter to his chest, closed his eyes, and wept. Around them, the first-class passengers who had once been so absorbed in their own worlds had changed. People no longer hid behind their status, their routines, their distractions. A woman clutched a tissue to her face, openly crying. A man who had once been too focused on his newspaper now looked shaken, as if he had just been reminded of something he had long buried. Even the flight attendant stood frozen, witnessing something sacred. JD looked down at his own hands, at the seat he had given up, and realized something. This wasn't just about a flight. It was about fate, about love, about the way a single act of kindness could ripple through time, connecting people in ways they could never have imagined. And it wasn't over yet. As the plane began its descent, the first-class cabin remained eerily silent. The usual rustling of newspapers, clinking of glasses, and quiet chatter were gone. Instead, there was only the hum of the engines and the unspoken weight of what had just happened. Clint Eastwood sat motionless in JD Vance's former seat, his fingers still gripping the letter. He hadn't let go of it since the moment it was handed to him, as if releasing it might make it disappear. JD, now seated a few rows behind in the economy section, kept stealing glances at the man he had idolized for years. But this wasn't the Clint Eastwood he had grown up watching in movies. This was a father who had just been given back a piece of his son through an act of fate. A soft ding echoed through the cabin as the plane prepared for landing. Passengers stirred slightly, but no one moved with the usual urgency of travelers eager to deplane. They weren't rushing to check their phones or gather their belongings. Instead, they sat in quiet reflection, their eyes still red from the tears they had shed. JD exhaled, bracing himself. He had seen a few passengers discreetly recording parts of what had happened. He knew that within minutes of landing, this story would be everywhere. The wheels touched down, and as the plane taxied toward the gate, the flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we deplane, we would like to take a moment to recognize two very special guests on board today. Our Vice President, Mr. JD Vance." Gasps filled the cabin. Some passengers had realized who he was, but others had not. And of course, a true American legend, Mr. Clint Eastwood. Applause erupted, not the polite kind reserved for celebrities, but something more, It was the sound of people clapping for what they had just witnessed, for the raw humanity that had unfolded before them. JD shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't one for public attention, especially not for something he had done instinctively. Clint, on the other hand, simply nodded, offering a small, knowing smile. As JD and Clint stepped off the plane, they were met with something neither of them had expected. The airport was packed. News crews, photographers, crowds of people, their phones raised, already recording. The story had traveled faster than they had. A reporter rushed forward, microphone in hand. "Mr. Eastwood! Mr. Vance! Can you tell us what happened on that flight?" Clint turned toward JD, then back to the reporter. His voice was steady, filled with quiet authority. "It's not about me." The reporter hesitated, confused. Clint continued, nodding toward JD. "It's about him, a man who did something good just because it was the right thing to do." JD swallowed hard. He hadn't expected Clint to put the attention on him. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a young woman stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, her eyes swollen from crying. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Mr. Eastwood?" she said, her voice unsteady. "You don't know me, but I think you need to hear this." Clint frowned slightly. "What is it, sweetheart?" The young woman inhaled sharply, blinking back fresh tears. "My father was on that flight, the one your son gave up his seat for." The world stopped. JD felt his breath hitch. Clint's entire body went rigid. "What?" His voice, once strong and unshakable, barely made a sound. The girl nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Your son's sacrifice. It saved my dad's life." A gasp swept through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters exchanged stunned glances. Clint stumbled back a step, his face going pale. JD instinctively reached out, steadying him. For a long moment, Clint just stood there, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The weight of everything, the past, the present, the sheer impossibility of fate, crashed over him. Then, without a word, he did the only thing that made sense. He opened his arms. The young woman didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, falling into his embrace, and in that moment nothing else mattered. Not the cameras, not the flashing lights, not the fact that the world was watching. It was just a father, a daughter, and a connection that had been waiting to be made for decades. JD wiped his eyes, overwhelmed by the sheer gravity of it all. The cameras caught every second, but for once, it didn't feel like news. It felt like history. As Clint Eastwood and JD Vance stood there in the heart of the airport, surrounded by cameras, reporters, and stunned onlookers, the weight of the moment settled over them. The world had just witnessed something far bigger than a simple flight, bigger than politics, bigger than celebrity. It was about fate, about kindness, about the power of a single choice. JD looked down at the coin in his palm, the one Clint had given him, the one that had belonged to his son. It was small, worn, and ordinary at first glance, but now JD understood. This wasn't just a coin, it was a symbol of sacrifice, of love, of the way one selfless act could ripple through time in ways no one could predict. Clint took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the young woman he had just embraced. His son was gone, but his actions, his heart, had lived on, touching lives in ways he never could have imagined. A nearby reporter finally found her voice. "Mr. Eastwood, Mr. Vance, what do you hope people take away from this moment?" Clint didn't hesitate. He turned to JD, then back to the cameras, his blue eyes still glistening with emotion. That the world still needs kindness, and that sometimes the smallest things, the things you don't think twice about, can change someone's life forever. JD nodded, his voice steady. "We live in a world that moves too fast. People forget to look out for one another, but today proves that one act, just one, can mean everything to someone else." The cameras kept flashing. The video of this moment would be replayed across news networks, shared on social media, and talked about around dinner tables for weeks to come. But beyond the headlines, beyond the viral clips, there was something much more important happening. A reminder that kindness still exists, that no title, no wealth, no fame is greater than the impact of a good heart, that the legacy we leave behind isn't in what we achieve for ourselves, but in what we do for others. Now, I ask you, the one reading this, what would you have done in JD Vance's place? Have you ever experienced a moment where a stranger's kindness changed your life? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's remind the world that kindness still matters, because sometimes one simple act can change everything.